Hi, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's program. I'm Raymond Lotta, and we're having a very important discussion of some of the big questions provoked by the new film Oppenheimer, written and directed by Christopher Nolan. The title of my talk is Robert Oppenheimer Served America's Empire. We have the responsibility to end this horror and bring a far better world into being. The film Oppenheimer is about the life and work of Robert Oppenheimer. He was the scientist who led the development of the atomic bomb, the nuclear weapon that the U.S. dropped on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in 1945. This was the first and only use of these monstrous weapons. Imperialist America gets ghastly credit for that distinction. And keep in mind that the U.S. refuses to apologize for murdering some 145,000 to 200,000 Japanese, overwhelmingly civilians, with this unprecedented weapon. I want to be clear about what we're talking about here, because one major problem of the film Oppenheimer is that it does not show the actual suffering caused by this weapon. August 6th, 1945, over Hiroshima, a U.S. bomber drops the weapon designed and produced by the Oppenheimer team. A blazing million-degree fireball detonates above Hiroshima, causing firestorms and shock waves with winds up to 1,000 miles an hour. Photos and film, diaries and oral histories, aerial surveys, and more capture some of this horror, but only some of it. Vast swaths of utter destruction and devastation of buildings, roads, parks, trees, and vegetation, all of what makes a city a city. Countless corpses scattered on roads, ruined, shadowy shapes, survivors dazed, the horribly injured, flesh peeled away and flapping. Others stumbling through dense smoke, a baby trying to suckle at the breast of partly burned corpse. Bodies washed up on riverbanks. Many who survived would suffer for years to come all kinds of illness, radiation diseases, and cancer. Let's take a look. That's Robert Oppenheimer. Keep going. There you see the destruction. A city flattened. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. And here we are, some 80 years later. The world is facing possible nuclear annihilation. The U.S., with its nuclear arsenal at the ready, is waging and escalating its proxy war with nuclear-armed Russia. By proxy war, I mean the U.S. is fighting Russia indirectly, arming and giving major direction to Ukraine, to those forces, in order to weaken Russia. The U.S. is ramping up its military threats and war preparations against China, which also has nuclear weapons. The U.S., Russia, and China are capitalist imperialist powers. Their economies function according to the competitive drive for profit and more profit. They expand, they invest globally in search of cheap labor, new markets for control over sources, over raw materials like cobalt and lithium, for electronic devices, titanium for the military. They contend with each other for control over key regions in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, everywhere. And they build up huge militaries to enforce and extend their global interests. The U.S. is the top imperialist dog, the largest economy in the world, resting on global supply chains of misery and exploitation, spending more on its military than the next 10 largest powers combined, including Russia and China. The U.S. has carried out more invasions, coups, and interventions than any empire in modern history, all in the name of fighting tyranny and spreading democracy. And here's a dirty little secret. The incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the genocidal ushering in of decades of global American dominance as that top imperialist power, what the U.S. rulers called at the time the American century. So there are 3 points that I want to get into more deeply. First, why World War II was not a good war of democracy versus fascist tyranny, but fundamentally a war of competing empires. Second, what led Robert Oppenheimer, a progressive person even with left-wing sympathies, to become complicit in terrible war crimes? And third, why we must demand, and why growing numbers and millions must be won to demand a whole new way to live, a fundamentally different system, one that will abolish nuclear weapons, and building the revolution to achieve that goal. So let's go back to World War II. We are taught that the U.S. entered and fought World War II to defeat fascist tyrannies. Now, we don't have time to get into this in detail, but a few basic facts and points of historical understanding are called for. World War II took place between 1939 and 1945. Two groupings of imperialist powers were fighting each other for global economic, political, and military dominance. On the one side were the so-called Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And on the other were the so-called Allies, principally England, France, and the United States. Germany aimed to be the top power of Europe and aimed to create a new colonial empire displacing England and France. Japan was seeking to be the dominant power in Asia and the Pacific. It had invaded China and was moving on French and English colonies. England and France, for their part, were seeking to hold on to their colonies, like India and Vietnam, and their spheres of influence in the Middle East and elsewhere, and to expand. The U.S. had a grand design to build up and assert its hegemonic influence and control in the Pacific and Asia, to become the banker to the world and dominant power in Europe, and to penetrate the empires of England and France in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. All of this required the defeat of Japan and Germany, whose grand aims of empire collided with America's. That is why we say that World War II was principally shaped by the deadly global clash between rival imperial empires. As for democracy, the democracy that the Allied powers claimed that they were fighting for. What is that democracy? The democracy that England said it was fighting for included its right to continue to extract wealth from India, Jamaica, Kenya, and countless other countries, and to put down anti-colonial revolts savagely. Winston Churchill, that avatar of democracy extolled and highlighted in the history textbooks, he was responsible for a famine in wartime India that cost the lives of millions of Indians as the British rulers, diverted grain for the British troops. The democracy that France said it was fighting for included its right to super-exploit labor and extract wealth in colonies of Southeast Asia and West Africa. As for the celebration of America's democratic ideals, ranged against Hitler's fascist master race tyranny and genocide, well, I recommend a book. The title of this book is Hitler's American Model: The United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law by James Whitman. You see, the Nazi leaders and policymakers were fucking inspired by America's racist immigration and citizenship laws and its violently enforced system of segregation and ideology of white supremacy, its laws forbidding racial intermarriage. The Nazis studied all of this closely in developing their anti-Jewish legislation and their policies of extermination. Now, there was another factor in World War II. It involved the then socialist Soviet Union. In 1917, the world's first socialist revolution took place in Russia, establishing the Soviet Union, with communists leading in building a liberating economy and society. Hitler and German imperialism trained their fire on the Soviet Union. In June 1941, the German imperialists launched a massive and incredibly brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union joined the alliance of the U.S., France, and Britain. No country lost more people in World War II than did the Soviet Union. 26 million people. The Nazis suffered 3/4 of their wartime losses fighting the Soviet Red Army. Here is a historical truth. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the Nazi war machine and played the decisive role in the defeat of Hitler by the Allied powers. So with this as background, we come to the decision by the U.S. to drop the atom bomb on Japan. Was that decision guided by the military requirements of defeating Japan? The truth is that Japan had already suffered major military setbacks. The truth is that Japan had sent messages through diplomatic channels indicating that it was willing to surrender. The truth is there was no direct military value in destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities that were largely civilian centers. No, the dropping of the atom bomb was an act of what the historian Gar Alperovitz has called atomic diplomacy. The Soviet Union had reached an understanding with the U.S., England, and France that it would invade Japan in 1945. But the U.S. wanted to make sure that it had total control over the development of Japan after the war. The dropping of the atom bomb was a statement. It was a warning. It was a threat to the then socialist Soviet Union that U.S. imperialism was calling the shots and would put up with no interference in the post-World War II world. The dropping of this horrific weapon was also a message to the whole world. The U.S. had come out of World War II as the top imperialist gangster. The U.S. was telling the world, don't mess with us, or this is what you might get. Now let's go back to Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the atom bomb. The film Oppenheimer tells the story of how he and the scientists who worked on the atom bomb thought they were doing this as a blow for democracy, to defeat Hitler and save humanity from what they saw as a Nazi fascist threat to human civilization. But in fact, these scientists became tools of America's empire, of the U.S. imperialist goal of forging an American century in which the U.S. would be an unrivaled world power economically, politically, and militarily. It was only a few short years after World War II ended that the U.S. set up its military alliance in Europe, NATO, with the U.S. ultimately stationing nuclear weapons in several of these NATO countries. It was only a few short years after this bomb was dropped that President Truman, who succeeded Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sent military and economic aid to governments and forces in Turkey and Greece to crush revolutionary movements there. It was only a few short years after the bomb was dropped that the U.S. was carrying out a genocidal war in Korea, responsible for the deaths of some 1.5 to 2 million people. And not only did Oppenheimer and these scientists become tools of empire that was proceeding in the way that I'm describing, even as they thought they were doing something else, they developed the very weapon that could destroy human civilization, the very thing they wanted to prevent. Indeed, the U.S., and this is very important, the U.S. made this weapon a centerpiece of its diplomacy and military strategy in the decades that followed World War II. And many people don't realize this, but U.S. imperialism reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first. Let me repeat that. The U.S. reserves the right to use nuclear weapons, to strike first with nuclear weapons. This is official military doctrine. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. had operational war plans that if the Soviet Union or China took military actions, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons and armed forces, the U.S. was prepared to unleash its entire nuclear arsenal and murder hundreds of millions of people. In his book, The Doomsday Machine, Daniel Ellsberg, the courageous whistleblower who released the Pentagon Papers that helped raise awareness of the monstrous, unjust, and immoral war in Vietnam. Well, in that book, he documents 24 crises in which the U.S. threatened or considered nuclear strikes against the Soviet Union, against revolutionary China, against Vietnam, as the U.S. was suffering major military defeats by the just Vietnamese struggle for liberation. But the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project had bought into that myth of America as a force for good. Those who fought for progressive causes, even those who called themselves communists, actively assisted in creating weapons that were and remain an existential threat to humanity. These progressives bought into and promulgated the idea that the U.S., for all its faults, are the good guys. And the international communist movement led by the Soviet Union promoted the view that the struggle in the imperialist countries was one of democracy And the international communist movement led by the Soviet Union promoted this view that the struggle in the imperialist countries was one of democracy versus fascism. And this was a grievous error that exacted incalculable political cost. It is our responsibility to think and act from the standpoint of the interests of world humanity, to recognize and act with the understanding that America is an empire of exploitation, misery, and plunder, vicious and vengeful, capable of doing no good. But too many liberals and progressives refuse to come to grips with this, delude themselves into thinking that there is some ineffable core good in the American way of democracy. Okay, there was slavery and genocide, but we're becoming a more perfect union. Or could, or should become that more perfect union. And the other guys, whether they were Hitler, whether they were the Japanese imperialists, whether today they're Putin and Xi Jinping, they're worse. They're the bad guys. They're autocratic tyrants. And so many people who should know better are now lining up behind the U.S. proxy war with Russia. And here I just want to hit at the nub of the matter, which is captured in this brilliant statement by Bob Avakian when we talk about democracy versus autocracy, fascism versus democracy. This is from Basics. And he says, the essence of what exists in the U.S. is not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures to enforce that capitalism, imperialism. What the U.S. spreads around the world is not democracy, but imperialism and political structures to enforce that imperialism. The film Oppenheimer is not the film for our times, although it is a film of our times. It is not offering the history lessons that we need. As an article on revcom.us points out, Christopher Nolan's film, which portrays the moral ambiguity of people like Oppenheimer, who ushered in this horrific weapon and war crime, and the nuclear arms race he came to regret, the film is itself full of unacceptable moral relativism and apologia for what the U.S. did in World War II. The film never reckons with the nature of the crime and doesn't even show, as we did, what happened in Hiroshima, and continues to propagate this as a tough but necessary decision in the war where the U.S. was the good guys. Now, there are people who, after watching the film Oppenheimer, will leave the theater thinking about the persecution that befell Oppenheimer for speaking out against the arms race. Indeed, he was used in the project to develop this ghastly weapon, and then, along with others, became the victim of repression and the career-destroying witch hunts that followed World War II, as the U.S. launched an anti-communist crusade targeting the then socialist Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the U.S., which was not a revolutionary party, but which did support the Soviet Union, and progressives and radical-minded people. But think about this. The immediate issue with Oppenheimer and the hearings that destroyed him was whether he would keep his security clearance. That is, would Robert Oppenheimer be able to continue to lend his expertise to the machinery, to the genocidal machinery of empire? There are some who will see this film and come out reflecting on the prospects and the horror of nuclear apocalypse. But the film Oppenheimer detaches this danger and this horror from the system of capitalism, imperialism, that produces these weapons, that perfects these weapons, that modernizes these weapons, the system that thinks and plans the unthinkable. Barbarous wars to extend and enforce the interests of empire, even nuclear war that could wipe out civilization. There are also some who see in this film a picture of Oppenheimer as a patriotic dissenter, a patriotic independent thinker who was punished for being that. This is the viewpoint of a review and reflection piece in The Nation by its editor Katerina Vanderhoeven. But here's the real lesson. Patriotism and loyalty to your imperialist country, even in its most quote-unquote enlightened variations, leads to service for these imperialist monsters. And we live in the belly of the beast, the heartland of imperialism. And as Bob Avakian emphasizes, it is our responsibility to focus our energies on exposing and opposing the crimes of the U.S. empire, its preparations for war, and work to make revolution to overthrow this system as soon as possible. If we lived in Russia, our responsibility would be to oppose our rulers there. And so too, if we lived in China. But we fucking live in America. And the people of the world, in countries that have been invaded and occupied by U.S. imperialism, whose natural resources have been stolen and poisoned, whose children have been driven into sweatshops, and 45,000 children working in the cobalt mines of Congo. The women in the countries that have become part of the global supply chains for a global sex industry of unspeakable degradation and cruelty. The people of the world are counting on us not to perfect this empire, not to perfect this union, but to put this empire into the museum of history. And right now, this capitalist imperialist system is hurtling towards another world war. As I said, as we know, the U.S. is waging that proxy war with Russia to preserve and extend its dominance, and using Ukrainians as cannon fodder to weaken Russia. Russia is aiming to create a rival pole of imperial power. The U.S. and Russia each has over 5,500 nuclear weapons. Some of these weapons are 80 times more destructively powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These weapons are horrible, indiscriminate, and life-ending. And by some estimates, a full-scale nuclear conflict between the U.S. and Russia could lead to 5 billion people dying. There's no adequate medical response for the scale of what could happen. There is no adequate fallback plan for the climate crisis, the climate chaos, and the crop reductions that would cause. There's no fallback plan for that. The hour is late, and way too many liberals and progressives either have their heads in the sand, ignoring what is shaping up in the world, or are putting their influence and energies into supporting the most oppressive and exploitative system that has ever existed, U.S. imperialism. They are swallowing the ideological Kool-Aid that Putin is the autocrat, America is the democratic light. America, of course, has installed, propped up, and sanitized autocratic regimes all over the world. In Central and Latin America, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Pakistan, the list goes on. But they are our autocrats. People have to wake up. As Bob Avakian has said, we can no longer afford to allow these imperialists to continue to dominate the world and determine the destiny of humanity. And it is a scientific fact that humanity does not have to live this way. Now, on everyone's seat is the Declaration. We need and we demand a whole new way to live, a fundamentally different system. I want to read from the introduction to this declaration. In the name of the people, the billions in this country and throughout the world who are treated as less than human, enslaved, exploited, oppressed, terrorized, brutalized, and murdered by the police, and slaughtered by the armed forces of this system we are now forced to live under, the system of capitalism imperialism. In the name of humanity, the billions in all parts of the world who are denied a decent life and a future worth living in, or any future at all, threatened with literal extinction because of the destruction of the environment by this system and the danger of nuclear war between the U.S. and its rivals in Russia and China. All of them ruthless imperialist powers. We can no longer afford to allow these imperialists to continue to dominate the world and determine the destiny of humanity. And it is a scientific fact that humanity does not have to live this way. A whole different way of living is possible. A whole different way to organize society with a radically different economic foundation and political system, emancipating relations among people, and an uplifting culture. All of this oriented to meeting the basic needs and fulfilling the highest interests of the masses of people. We declare and we demand the existing capitalist imperialist system and institutions of government in this country must be abolished and dismantled and replaced by a new socialist system based on the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America. Now, this document, this declaration, sets forth 6 critical dimensions of the new socialist society based on the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America. And those are a whole new dimension of freedom and rights of the people, a whole different economy to meet fundamental needs and serve highest interests, eliminating discrimination, inequality, and oppression in every form, education to actually educate and empower the masses of people, health care to serve the people. And then this 6th one, which I want to read fully. Abolishing nuclear weapons, finally abolishing war, and systematically addressing the environmental crisis. The new socialist government will not develop or use nuclear weapons, and will take concrete steps and wage determined struggle to abolish nuclear weapons everywhere, with the ultimate goal of finally abolishing wars among human beings, with the abolition of the capitalist imperialist system and all systems and relations of exploitation and oppression, which are the basis of wars. This new socialist government will move quickly, systematically, and effectively to address the already acute and fast accelerating environmental crisis, with the aim of bringing into being a world where humanity can truly be fit caretakers of the earth. And the Declaration says, following what I'm reading, all this is not just a dream or a wish. It is what is possible and necessary in the interest of the masses of humanity and of humanity as a whole. And yes, the world is teetering towards world war. The fascists in the U.S. are on a rampage, stripping women of the right to abortion, banning books, and hoping to ban LGBTQ people. In early July, the planet recorded the hottest 3 days in 125,000 years. This revolution is urgently needed. And there's another side to the accelerating nightmare. As the proclamation, "We are the Revcoms," which is also on your seat, says, this is a rare time when the capitalist imperialists who rule over us in this country are deeply divided in a way they have not been since the Civil War in the 1860s. And the country is being ripped apart, with one section moving toward an outright fascist form of rule, the other fighting for the horrific way of the normal way this system has operated. And in any case, that normal way is full of oppression, destruction, and the real danger of wiping out humanity. For these reasons, this revolution we are working for is urgently necessary and more possible. Now, Bob Avakian has analyzed that these splits and divisions, the disruptions to normal life, and the fact that the rulers are more and more unable to rule in the old way, this can shake people's belief in the permanency of this system and whether things have to be this way, stay this way. But as he also emphasizes, this can only happen if revolutionary forces are out among the people, shining a light on the deeper reality of what is happening and why, and bringing out that there is an alternative to living this way. The discussion and debate about Oppenheimer, the film, provides an important opportunity and the necessity to struggle fiercely with people over the role of the U.S. in the world, over the nature of this system, and the looming danger of World War III. It provides an opening to bring forward the revolutionary way out of the madness as concentrated in the proclamation and declaration that people have. We need to reach broad sections of people with the message, it is this system, not humanity, that must become extinct, and win people to become part of and to contribute to the revolution to make that a reality. Thank you very much.